What happens when two corrupt cops think they've cornered their target, only to realize too late that he's not just their victim, but their worst nightmare? This isn't just a fight for freedom. It's a battle to expose the very system they abused. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden hue over the city streets, as Julius Carter adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror. The 32-year-old lawyer was on his way to court, a briefcase of critical documents resting on the passenger seat. It wasn't just any case. It was a high-stakes hearing that could set a precedent for racial justice in the city. Julius had spent weeks preparing, knowing every detail could make or break his client's future. As he turned onto a quieter road, the blaring of a police siren shattered the morning stillness. Julius glanced at his rearview mirror to see two squad cars closing in, their lights flashing. He sighed, pulling to the side of the road. This wasn't the first time he'd been stopped in his sleek black car, but something about the intensity of the sirens felt different. Two officers emerged, one stocky with a ruddy complexion and thinning blonde hair, the other wiry with sharp features. Sergeant Harley and Lieutenant Wallace approached Julius's car with the air of men who enjoyed their authority a little too much. Harley tapped on the driver's window with his flashlight. "License and registration," Harley said, his tone curt. Julius nodded, moving deliberately to retrieve his documents. "Any reason for the stop, officer?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. "You were speeding," Harley replied, though Julius had been carefully adhering to the limit. Wallace smirked as he leaned against the car. Fancy suit for a guy out joyriding this early. Julius handed over his license and registration, his lawyer's instincts already sensing something was off. Harley examined the papers, his eyes narrowing as if searching for a flaw. "What's in the briefcase?" Wallace asked, nodding toward the passenger seat. "Legal documents," Julius replied evenly. "Mind if we take a look?" Wallace's tone wasn't a question. "Actually, I do mind," Julius said, meeting the officer's gaze. "Unless you have probable cause or a warrant, I believe my right to privacy is protected." The tension thickened. Harley's smirk faded, replaced with a stern glare. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Julius hesitated but complied. The moment his polished shoes hit the pavement, Wallace grabbed his wrist. "Hands on the car!" Wallace barked. "What's this about?" Julius demanded, his voice steady but firm. "Resisting," Harley replied casually, snapping cuffs onto Julius's wrists. Julius looked over his shoulder at the officers, his lawyer's mind racing. "This is unlawful. You have no grounds for detaining me." "You can take it up with the court," Wallace sneered, shoving Julius toward the squad car. The neighborhood began to stir, with a few curious onlookers peeking from windows or slowing their walks to see what was happening. Julius caught a glimpse of a teenager recording the interaction on their phone. As Julius was pushed into the back seat of the police car, he remained composed, but his mind churned. He had a crucial hearing to attend, a case that couldn't wait, and now he was on his way to a precinct for a crime he hadn't committed. The officers exchanged smug glances as they climbed into the car, their laughter echoing in Julius's ears. But Julius didn't retaliate. Instead, he took a deep breath, staring out the window at the morning light. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The metal clang of the cell door echoed through the precinct as Julius Carter was led into the holding area. The officers escorted him in with a mix of arrogance and mockery, their smirks as sharp as the cuffs digging into his wrists. Julius's tailored suit and polished demeanor stood in stark contrast to the cold, dimly lit room filled with scuffed walls and graffiti-marked benches. Sergeant Harley shoved him onto the bench with an unnecessary force. "Welcome to your new office, counselor," he sneered. "I'm sure it's a step up from whatever fancy corner office you're used to." Julius didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he adjusted his glasses and settled into the bench with an air of calm authority that seemed to disarm Harley, if only slightly. "You're wasting your time and mine," Julius said evenly. "You've got nothing to hold me on." Lieutenant Wallace snorted from his post near the door. "Speeding, resisting, and let's not forget the attitude problem," he said, his grin widening. "Plenty to hold you while we sort things out." Julius locked eyes with him. "You're holding me because you think you can, but by the time this is over, you'll regret that assumption." The quiet confidence in Julius's voice was unnerving. Harley exchanged a glance with Wallace, their bravado faltering for just a moment. They recovered quickly, though, and Harley leaned closer, dropping his voice to a mocking whisper. "You think you're untouchable because of that suit? Because you talk pretty?" He tapped his badge. "In here, you're just another perp, and I call the shots." Julius didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying Harley as though he were a puzzle to be solved. "Interesting approach, Sergeant," he said, "but I'd advise against doubling down. This isn't going to end the way you think it will." Before Harley could respond, a phone buzzed on his belt. He stepped away to answer it, leaving Wallace to keep watch. Julius leaned back, his calm gaze unwavering. Moments later, Harley returned, his face a shade paler. Wallace looked up, confused. "What's up?" Harley avoided his partner's gaze, muttering something about needing to check on something. He disappeared into the hallway, leaving Wallace and Julius alone. Wallace, clearly unsettled, tried to maintain his composure. "You know, we deal with guys like you all the time," he said, though his voice lacked the earlier confidence. "Do you?" Julius asked, his tone casual but cutting. "Because I doubt you've dealt with someone like me." Wallace frowned, his attempt at a retort interrupted by Harley's return. The sergeant's smugness was gone, replaced with barely concealed tension. "You're free to go," Harley said gruffly, avoiding Julius's eyes. Wallace blinked. "What? Just like that?" Harley's jaw tightened. "The chief wants him out. Now." Julius stood, brushing imaginary dust from his suit. "Seems you've run out of time," he said, his voice laced with quiet satisfaction. As Harley unlocked the cuffs, Julius turned to Wallace. "Word of advice? When you think you've won, remember who's watching. The law works both ways." The tension in the room was palpable as Julius walked out, his confidence unshaken. The officers watched him go, their earlier bravado replaced with uncertainty. They had underestimated him, and they both knew it. Julius Carter sat quietly in the holding cell, his sharp mind at work. The echo of Harley's taunts still lingered, but Julius paid them no mind. He had seen men like Harley and Wallace before, arrogant, overconfident, and convinced of their invincibility. As they laughed and swapped smug remarks just outside the cell, Julius began constructing his defense, analyzing every detail of the arrest. Their misconduct was glaring: the false arrest, fabricated charges, and blatant racial bias. He could use these to not only clear his name but also expose the corruption within the precinct. When Harley sauntered back into the holding area, wearing his usual smirk, Julius asked, "Can I have my phone call now?" Harley raised an eyebrow, amused. "What? Gonna call your mommy?" Wallace chuckled, but Julius remained composed. "I'll call my lawyer," Julius replied, his tone measured. "I assume I still have that right, don't I?" Harley leaned against the bars, feigning boredom. Sure. Call your lawyer, like that'll do you any good." The disdain in his voice was clear, but Julius detected a flicker of unease in Wallace's expression. After a moment, Harley motioned for an officer to give Julius access to a phone. Julius dialed the number he knew by heart, connecting with his trusted legal team. "I need you to start working on something big," he said calmly, outlining the situation. His team sprang into action, preparing to subpoena body cam footage and gather evidence. Julius was meticulous, ensuring they covered every angle. As he hung up, his calm exterior remained unshaken. "What's the big deal?" Harley sneered when Julius returned to his seat. "Some public defender gonna sweep in and save you?" Julius adjusted his cuffs and met Harley's gaze. "Actually, I'm a lawyer. I plan to represent myself." Harley laughed outright. "You? A lawyer? Sure, buddy." Wallace's nervous glance at Harley revealed cracks in their confidence. Julius caught it. He was playing the long game, and the officers had no idea they were walking straight into a trap. Over the next few hours, Julius carefully reviewed every memory of the arrest. The way Harley had thrown the papers, the smug tone in Wallace's voice as he recorded the incident. It all painted a picture of men abusing their power. Julius knew their story wouldn't hold under scrutiny. The body cam footage would reveal the truth, and their lies would collapse under the weight of evidence. His mind raced with strategies. He would cross-examine them, exposing their inconsistencies and planting doubt in the courtroom. He would use the footage and any witnesses to show their misconduct. This wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about holding them accountable. Julius leaned back in his seat, letting a small, determined smile play on his lips. Harley and Wallace were about to learn a lesson they wouldn't forget. The courtroom was abuzz with low murmurs as Julius Carter entered, still in cuffs, but carrying himself with unshakable composure. The polished leather shoes, tailored charcoal suit, and confident stride clashed with the image of a man accused of aggressive behavior. Julius's presence alone seemed to unnerve Harley and Wallace, who sat at the prosecution table, their bravado from earlier slightly dimmed. The judge, a stern man with a graying beard, glanced down at his docket, then up at Julius. His face betrayed curiosity. This wasn't the typical defendant. The session began with the prosecutor outlining the charges. His tone was steady but over-rehearsed as he painted Julius as uncooperative and belligerent during his arrest. The defendant resisted every lawful order, the prosecutor claimed, glancing toward Harley and Wallace. He posed a threat to the officers, forcing them to act swiftly. Harley and Wallace nodded in sync, their confidence returning as they prepared to testify. One by one, they delivered their accounts. Harley went first, gesturing theatrically as he described the arrest. "He lunged at me," Harley claimed, throwing in a dramatic pause. "I had no choice but to restrain him. It was a volatile situation." Wallace picked up from there, his tone dripping with faux sincerity. "We were doing our job, protecting the public. The defendant's behavior was out of control." From the defendant's table, Julius listened intently, his face unreadable. He tapped a pen lightly against the table, noting every inconsistency in their statements. The prosecutor's questions seemed to bolster the officer's story, but to Julius, they only highlighted the cracks. Harley described Julius's alleged aggression with exaggerated movements, while Wallace's timeline didn't quite match. When the prosecutor finished, the judge turned to Julius. "Mr. Carter, do you wish to respond?" Julius rose from his seat, the chains on his wrists clinking softly. "Your Honor, I'll be representing myself today." A ripple of surprise spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor frowned, caught off guard, while Harley and Wallace exchanged uneasy glances. Julius approached the bench, calm and methodical. "Before I proceed, I'd like to submit a preliminary motion," he said. The judge nodded, granting him permission. Julius then pivoted to the jury, addressing them directly. "The charges against me are built on a foundation of lies. What you'll see today isn't just a defense, it's the truth." He began his cross-examination with Harley, whose smirk faltered as Julius's questions cut through his testimony. "Sergeant Harley," Julius began, his tone sharp, "you claim I lunged at you. Can you demonstrate exactly how I moved?" Harley hesitated, glancing at Wallace for support. Well, it was sudden, like this." He made a vague gesture that looked more like a stumble than a lunge. Julius arched an eyebrow. "So, you're saying I adjusted my tie in a threatening manner?" Laughter rippled through the courtroom, and Harley's face reddened. Next, Julius turned to Wallace. "Lieutenant Wallace, you mentioned my volatile behavior. Could you clarify what you meant?" Wallace fumbled for words. "Well, you were loud, aggressive." "Loud, you say?" Julius pressed. "Did I raise my voice or make threats?" Wallace stammered. "No, but your tone—" Julius cut him off. "Was calm, wasn't it?" Wallace's silence spoke volumes. Julius's confidence grew with each question, his strategy dismantling the officer's narrative piece by piece. By the time he returned to his seat, the courtroom was hanging on his every word. The officer's smugness was gone, replaced by visible unease. Julius glanced at the judge, who appeared increasingly skeptical of the prosecution's case. The tide was turning, and Julius was far from done. As the session resumed, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted palpably. Julius Carter, now firmly in control, stood ready to unveil the evidence that would dismantle the officer's claims. The prosecutor appeared flustered, flipping through his notes as if searching for a lifeline. Harley and Wallace sat rigidly at the prosecution table, their earlier bravado replaced by thinly veiled anxiety. Julius addressed the judge, his tone measured but commanding. "Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to introduce crucial evidence to this case, evidence that will clarify what truly transpired during my arrest." The judge nodded, his curiosity piqued. "Proceed." Mr. Carter. Julius turned to the court clerk, who handed him a remote connected to the courtroom's display screen. "Let's start with the body cam footage," Julius said, his words cutting through the room's tense silence. The lights dimmed slightly as the first video played. The footage showed Julius standing by his car, calm and compliant, as Harley barked orders. The audio captured Julius's measured voice, stating his rights and asking why he was being detained. The courtroom watched intently as Harley's tone became increasingly aggressive, and Wallace could be heard chuckling in the background. At one point, the video clearly showed Harley tossing Julius's legal documents onto the ground, a moment that contradicted their testimony about Julius's supposed aggression. Gasps rippled through the spectators as the video continued. Harley and Wallace exchanged panicked glances, their discomfort evident. The judge leaned forward, his expression hardening with each passing second. Julius paused the footage and faced the courtroom. "This is what really happened," he said, his voice steady. "I was calm. I complied. The aggression came from the officers, not me." The second piece of evidence was even more damning. Internal police communications Julius had subpoenaed. Emails and text messages between Harley and Wallace revealed their preconceived bias. One message read, "Saw a guy in a fancy car. Let's see if he can talk his way out of this one." Another stated, "This will be fun. They always fold." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and the judge struck his gavel to restore order. Harley's face flushed, and Wallace stared down at the table, avoiding eye contact with anyone. But Julius wasn't finished. "I'd like to call a witness," he announced. The judge granted the request, and a middle-aged woman stepped forward. She was a passerby who had witnessed the arrest and recorded a portion of it on her phone. Her testimony corroborated the body cam footage, painting a clear picture of the officer's misconduct. "They treated him like a criminal from the start," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But he was calm the whole time. He kept asking why they were stopping him, and they just kept mocking him." As she stepped down, the judge addressed the prosecutor. "Do you have any rebuttal to this evidence?" The prosecutor hesitated, his face pale. No, Your Honor. Not at this time." Julius returned to his seat, his calm demeanor unshaken. The judge's gaze lingered on Harley and Wallace, his disappointment palpable. "This court will reconvene after a thorough review of the evidence," he announced, his tone heavy with implication. Julius sat back, his hands resting on the table. The officer's lies had been exposed, and the balance of power in the courtroom had shifted irreversibly. As the courtroom emptied following the explosive revelations, the storm brewing inside quickly found its way outside. A journalist present in the gallery had been furiously typing on her laptop, capturing every twist of the courtroom drama. By the time Julius left the courthouse that evening, an article titled "Corrupt Cops Exposed in Courtroom Bombshell" was already making rounds on social media. The journalist had laid it out in vivid detail. Julius Carter, a distinguished black attorney, had dismantled a fabricated case against him with the precision of a surgeon. The piece highlighted the damning evidence, from the body cam footage to the exposed text messages, and called out the systemic racism embedded in the officer's actions. Within hours, the story went viral, drawing national attention. Hashtags like #Justice for Julius and #Expose Corruption began trending on Twitter. Support poured in from all corners, lawyers, activists, and everyday people sharing their outrage and personal stories of similar experiences. Videos of the courtroom evidence, clipped and shared by onlookers, circulated widely, with millions of views within a day. At the precinct, the backlash hit like a tidal wave. Phone lines were jammed with calls demanding answers. Emails flooded the chief's inbox, many of them from civil rights organizations and media outlets requesting interviews. The precinct's social media pages were bombarded with comments calling for the immediate suspension of Harley and Wallace. The pressure on the department grew unbearable when a prominent civil rights leader retweeted the article, adding, "This isn't just about two bad cops. This is a system that protects them. We demand accountability." Meanwhile, Julius found himself at the center of a whirlwind. His phone buzzed non-stop with messages of support, media requests, and offers to join advocacy campaigns. Though the attention was overwhelming, Julius remained focused. He agreed to a live interview with a major news network, knowing the platform could amplify the larger issue. Sitting in a brightly lit studio, Julius spoke with calm authority. "What happened to me isn't unique," he said, looking directly into the camera. "It's a reflection of a broken system that allows unchecked power to thrive. If we want true justice, we need systemic change, not just accountability for individuals, but reforms that prevent this from happening in the first place." The interview struck a chord. Viewers praised Julius's composure and clarity, and his words became a rallying cry for reform. Civil rights organizations began organizing marches and town halls, using his case as a catalyst to demand changes in policing practices. At the precinct, Harley and Wallace were no longer strutting with confidence. Reporters camped outside, microphones ready, while activists held signs calling for their termination. The department, under immense scrutiny, announced that both officers had been placed on administrative leave pending a formal investigation. The fallout didn't stop there. The public demanded more than suspensions. They wanted transparency and systemic reform. A petition calling for mandatory bias training and independent oversight for police misconduct cases garnered over 500,000 signatures in 2 days. For Julius, the viral attention was bittersweet. While he was gratified that the truth had come to light, he couldn't ignore the deeper pain that came with knowing how common his experience was. In interviews and public statements, he continued to emphasize that his case was just the tip of the iceberg. "This isn't about me," he told a packed town hall meeting, his voice resonating through the room. "It's about ensuring that no one else has to go through what I did. It's about justice, fairness, and the right to be treated with dignity, no matter who you are." The room erupted in applause, and Julius felt a flicker of hope. The momentum was building, and he was determined to keep pushing forward. The system had tried to silence him, but now it was his voice that was leading the charge for change. As the fallout from the courtroom revelations reached a fever pitch, the precinct found itself in crisis mode. The once confident officers, Harley and Wallace, now sat in a conference room, flanked by their union representative and a stern-faced internal affairs investigator. The air was heavy with tension as the investigator laid out the charges against them, bolstered by the damning evidence Julius Carter had presented in court. The body cam footage that had mysteriously malfunctioned was recovered and reviewed, revealing not only their misconduct during Julius's arrest, but also a troubling pattern in their interactions with other civilians. Complaints of excessive force, fabricated charges, and racial bias that had been previously dismissed were now revisited with scrutiny. Internal Affairs launched a full-scale investigation, and the press swarmed the precinct like vultures circling prey. The department's chief, clearly shaken by the public backlash, held an emergency press conference. Standing before a sea of cameras, he began, "We acknowledge the serious concerns raised by the recent case involving Mr. Julius Carter. We are committed to transparency and holding our officers accountable for their actions." He announced that both Harley and Wallace had been placed on unpaid suspension, pending the outcome of the investigation. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere was far less measured. Harley paced angrily in the precinct's locker room, ranting to anyone who would listen. "This is a witch hunt. All because of that lawyer playing the race card. He's twisting the system against us." Wallace, however, sat quietly on a bench, staring at his hands. The bravado that had defined him in the courtroom was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. Meanwhile, Julius's legal team worked tirelessly to ensure that the officers faced more than just departmental discipline. They filed formal complaints with the state's attorney general's office, pushing for criminal charges of misconduct and abuse of power. Civil rights groups, galvanized by Julius's story, joined the effort, organizing protests outside the precinct and city hall. In the court of public opinion, the verdict was clear. Social media was awash with calls for justice, and the hashtag #Harley and Wallace accountability trended nationwide. News outlets published op-eds about the urgent need for police reform, with Julius's case cited as a prime example of systemic failure. Harley's and Wallace's personal lives also began to unravel. Neighbors avoided them, their children faced questions at school, and their names became synonymous with disgrace. Harley, ever defiant, tried to spin the narrative, granting an ill-advised interview where he claimed to be the victim of a media smear campaign. The public backlash to his comments was swift and unforgiving. Wallace, on the other hand, began to crack under the pressure. Late one night, he reached out to his union representative, confessing his regret and expressing a willingness to cooperate with the investigation. "I didn't sign up for this," he admitted, his voice trembling. I don't want my whole life to end like this." The department's leadership, under immense scrutiny, announced plans to implement mandatory bias training for all officers and establish an independent oversight committee to review cases of alleged misconduct. While these steps were seen as progress, activists and community leaders emphasized that they were only the beginning. Through it all, Julius remained resolute. He declined settlement offers from the department, making it clear that his goal was systemic change, not personal gain. "This isn't just about me," he said during a televised interview. "It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure the humiliation and injustice I faced." As the investigation into Harley and Wallace deepened, the officers' reckoning became inevitable. Their arrogance had blinded them to the consequences of their actions, but now they were forced to confront the reality of their choices. The system they had wielded as a weapon was now turning against them, piece by piece. Julius Carter's life took on a new trajectory after the courtroom revelations and the public uproar that followed. What began as a deeply personal ordeal had transformed into a mission far greater than himself. With the support of civil rights organizations and a rapidly growing social media following, Julius became a prominent voice in the fight for justice and police reform. He started by leveraging the publicity from his case to push for tangible change. Julius appeared on national news networks discussing the systemic issues highlighted by his experience. "This isn't an isolated incident," he told one interviewer. "It's a symptom of a much larger problem, one that requires immediate and sustained action." Julius partnered with advocacy groups to propose a series of reforms aimed at increasing police accountability. Among them were mandatory body cam usage, with strict penalties for tampering or failing to activate the devices, independent oversight committees to review misconduct cases, and comprehensive anti-bias training for all law enforcement officers. His legal expertise gave weight to his proposals, and his calm, reasoned approach resonated with both policymakers and the public. Julius's message was clear. Systemic injustice could not be eradicated overnight, but incremental steps could lay the foundation for meaningful progress. In addition to his media appearances and policy advocacy, Julius became a mentor to young law students and aspiring activists. He spoke at universities, sharing his story and encouraging students to use their education to challenge injustice. "The law is a powerful tool," he told them, "but it's only as just as the people who wield it. That's where you come in." Julius's efforts also extended to the community. He organized town halls and workshops, creating spaces where residents could voice their concerns about policing and learn how to hold their local departments accountable. These events fostered a sense of empowerment among attendees, many of whom had previously felt voiceless in the face of systemic oppression. The momentum continued to build as Julius's advocacy inspired others to share their own stories of injustice. The hashtag #Justice with Julius became a rallying cry for those seeking change, uniting people across the country in a shared commitment to equity and accountability. Despite the mounting demands on his time, Julius never lost sight of the personal toll his ordeal had taken. He made a point of reflecting on his journey, recognizing the strength he had drawn from his community and his own resilience. "This fight isn't easy," he said during one speech, "but it's necessary. And as long as there's injustice, we can't afford to stop." By channeling his pain into progress, Julius turned a moment of humiliation and adversity into a catalyst for change. His unwavering dedication to justice and his ability to inspire others ensured that his story would not only be remembered, but would also leave a lasting impact on the fight for equality. The courtroom was packed to capacity on the final day of Julius Carter's trial. The air was thick with tension and anticipation as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. Julius sat at the defense table, his posture calm but resolute. This moment was not just about clearing his name. It was about sending a message that justice could not be manipulated by those in power. The judge, a seasoned and stern figure, looked over the room before speaking. "After thorough review of the evidence presented," he began, "this court finds the charges against Mr. Julius Carter baseless and without merit. All charges are dismissed." His voice was firm, each word punctuating the weight of the decision. The gallery erupted into murmurs, then applause. Julius stood, a faint smile crossing his face as the courtroom filled with the sound of vindication. The two officers, Harley and Wallace, sat frozen, their earlier bravado replaced by a look of utter disbelief. The judge continued, turning his attention to the prosecution. "The conduct displayed by Officers Harley and Wallace during this case, both in their initial actions and in court, is deeply troubling. This court strongly recommends a comprehensive review of their actions and the precinct's practices." As the gavel fell, Julius turned to face the crowd. His supporters had grown exponentially since the start of his trial, and now they stood clapping and cheering, their faces beaming with pride. Among them were civil rights activists, fellow lawyers, and ordinary citizens who had followed his case with bated breath. Outside the courthouse, a sea of journalists and cameras awaited. Julius walked down the steps, flanked by his legal team and supporters. When he reached the bottom, he paused, turning to address the crowd. "Today is not just a victory for me," he said, his voice clear and steady. "It's a victory for everyone who has ever been unjustly targeted or silenced. This is proof that when we stand together, when we demand accountability, We can make change. His words were met with applause and chants of solidarity. The story had transcended Julius's personal experience, igniting a national conversation about racial profiling and police misconduct. As he stood before the throng of supporters and cameras, Julius felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The fight was far from over, but this was a crucial step forward. Later that evening, Julius returned to his office, now inundated with messages of support from across the country. Among them was a letter from a young law student who had watched the trial closely. "Your strength inspires me to keep pushing forward," it read. "Thank you for showing us what justice looks like." Julius smiled, his resolve reaffirmed. His battle had not just cleared his name, it had laid the groundwork for a broader fight against systemic injustice. As he prepared for the next chapter, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, ready to continue using his voice and expertise to make the world a fairer plow.